Hello, my name is Shinay Tredeau, and I'm here with Bhavani Maki. And today we are joined by a special guest, Sherry Cassedy. Sherry is a teacher, a published author, wife, mother, and grandmother. She brings a wealth of understanding as a lifelong practitioner of Catholic mysticism, spirituality, and her deep love of yoga. She holds a master's degree in transpersonal psychology. She is a lawyer for over 35 years and a longtime student and teacher of Patanjali's Yoga Sūtra. She shares spiritual conversation and mystic insights regularly with her weekly Monday Yoga Satsang and Friday online Gospel Reflection. Sherry also edited Bhavani's first book, The Yogi's Roadmap, Patanjali Yoga Sutra as a Path of Self-Realization. We invited Sherry today to join the conversation because we received a request to explore the interface of yoga and Catholic teachings. We hope to glean some of Sherry's insights as we weave our way through this immense topic. Welcome, Sherry. I'm honored to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
And welcome back, Bhavani.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually sitting here with chicken skin, and on the verge of tears, just feeling the diaspora, excuse me. I'm so moved of Rama's teachings and the threads that have brought us together. So, wow. Yeah, just the gravity of this moment, the gravitational pull that has brought us together. And we are sitting in the presence of a true heavy here. So thank you, Sherry, for always being so generous with your time, with yourself, and you offer so much wisdom, practical insight. When I have practical questions, I turn to Sherry. So thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you. And I was saying, as much as I love Catholic mysticism and as much as I love yoga philosophy and the sutra, this interface is really the sweet spot, the place to dive in. Yeah.
Let's do it. Let's dive right in. Sherry, do you want to begin with
Sure.
whatever anything and everything? We'd love to hear.
Okay. Well, I think a good place to start is just how I got into yoga. So I was born and raised Catholic and struggled throughout my life, continuing to the present day, with reconciling myself with the church. So that, the church has changed dramatically over these 65 years, and I've changed dramatically. So continuing to find an authentic place to be with the Catholic tradition and the Catholic mysticism and teaching. And it's just been a fabulous journey. But so in 2003, I took a sabbatical. My family took a sabbatical. So my husband and my youngest son and I came to Kauai for a year. And part of my intention for the year was to practice with Bhavani. So I had not met Bhavani, but I had heard at a retreat at Spirit Rock from another student that the premier woman yoga teacher in the West was on Kauai. So I thought, okay.
Meet her.
So I dove in. I wasn't working for the year, so I had a whole year off to dive in to self-exploration and the island exploration. So I started practicing with Bhavani, intense asana practice, very just completely captivating and consuming. And then in one of the classes, as Bhavani teaches, as many of you know, she weaves the sutra into the asana class. So you're in asana and she's reciting sutra. So I'm in some pose and she says, Tada drashtu svarupe vashtanam. Then, when we've calmed the stormy nature of the mind, the seer resides in her own true nature, which is brilliant and pure and light. And as a lifelong Catholic, that message was so powerful and counter to a lot of what I had learned, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, like I'm a sinner, I'm a sinner. And my experience had been, very much that I was unworthy. So to hear this teaching that that's really the mind, and at our essence, we're pure. One was completely true. I knew as soon as I heard it, this is absolute truth. And it is contrary to everything that I've been taught. So how am I gonna bring that together? So that was the beginning of this unfolding of this journey of the interface between the two, because I wasn't willing to reject or let go of either tradition.
Do you find that like I'm really getting the visceral feeling because I know what it was like in that room in Yoga Hanalei and feeling the visceral sensation of those teachings hit us. And so I'm really getting that as a reminder as you're talking. And so tell me about what happened next, because you didn't, it's not like you renounced the Catholic faith or that tradition at all, but I hear a sort of deepening or another side door opening. So tell me what happened next.
Well, so what you're speaking to too is a big part of it is the embodiment, right? So it's not just sitting in a class and reading a book and hearing a teaching. It's like you're in your body and you're open in a very different way to these teachings, right? So hearing the teaching and taking it in through all the senses and the breath and the body also allowed it to pass through all of my, kind of mental resistance, right? And to that point, my understanding of Catholicism had been more intellectual, and I hadn't kind of recognized the really embodied aspect of Catholicism. Sacraments are an embodied outward grace that reflects the inward grace. So there were connections that I started to make through the yoga teachings back to this deep understanding of Catholicism that lit up my Catholic understanding. So that was really exciting, is seeing things coming forward. Jesus teaching, the kingdom of God is within. I never knew what that meant. I could never figure that out. But in yoga, then starting to peel back the layers and really dive into consciousness and our own self-understanding, and then understanding that at the heart of it is this pure light divine aspect. The kingdom of God is within. Things started to connect by just continuing to practice. So during that year sabbatical, I didn't, kind of find a Catholic community here on Kauai to drop in with. So I really dove into yoga wholeheartedly as my spiritual exploration, and it kept, rather than taking anything away from Catholicism, it just kept deepening and, like I say, lighting up aspects of Catholicism because of that yogic teaching, that truth, valid cognition, true knowledge, that the signs are the authoritative text or teacher and deduction, but direct experience. And I was having this direct experience, and yoga was teaching me to pay attention to that was a valid source of truth, which is also different than kind of what we're taught in the Catholic tradition. So the idea of yoga as a science, that this is something that you learn through doing, that the yogis say, take nothing on faith. Don't take my word for it. And Bhavani was constantly quoting her teacher, you do. Like, we have to go and do it for ourselves. So that was extremely powerful, because it wasn't being pushed on me, which I think is sometimes the sense of discomfort, right? That if I go into a yoga classes, there's some spiritual teaching that's going to be imposed, and it's invited, it's always offered, but never imposed. And it's for us to find out for ourselves. We have to do it through our own experience. So that was also really empowering to be able to lean in and trust my experience. Um, and and as Bhavani knows, for me as a student to get out of my head. So that was one of the big gifts from Bhavani, was telling me, yeah, Sherry, your mind is a great asset, and it has limitations. So at some point you have to go beyond. So that was also just part of the unfolding, I would say, really just a complete unfolding in that exploration.
It's interesting. As it's like they say that life only makes sense when you play it backwards, and feeling the richness of, over 2 decades of our interface and everything that we bring. And then how in the, in the training, it's like part of the experiences. I give the medicine and I prescribe particular sutra. So for Sherry, and I think it was the first time I actually ever did that. So you were the first one to receive that that little body with Sutra 117, which is like, every time I turn to that sutra, I'm like, oh, this is like, it has you woven into it. And speaking about that vitarka vichara, where it's like, yeah, use logic, but logic's only going to take you so far. And then vichara, which is, coming to our senses, losing our mind, blowing our cover. I get it. I come from academia, and my mind is a wonderful tool. And it's also like, in some ways, it's an overstrength that can mask parts of myself that are rich. And in my little foray, which was maybe a couple year of reading some of the Catholic mystics, where you develop this capacity as a visionary, and entering into the wound in the heart, and feeling where the heart has been lanced open. It's just it's just so powerful. And I love the way, being a linguist daughter, where we take words kind of at face value, like the holy, but the holy implies something bigger, a greater integrity, a wholeness, doesn't it? So then we start to go like, well, what is, these words, they're metaphoric, and they're speaking to something deeper within us. And what I love about the sutra is that it's not asking you to believe or not believe. And I so appreciate your capacity to hold this interface and realize that somewhere in there, like standing in the middle of the middle, standing in the fire in which we're transforming our ideas, which, Patanjali says constructs our sense of who we are, where we belong, what we don't subscribe to. There's this rich field in which opposites can be true. You know what I mean? Like, and then of course, we'll be like, but how do I iterate that into words? It's too sweet for words, right? But that's a place of growing and learning, and the mysticism in which we like consecrate life as being held within that crucible. Yeah.
Well, and I remember Bhavani would teach a Tuesday night class, the Relax Deeply. So we'd all come into the studio and set up our little camp.
Die slowly. Sorry.
Have our mats, put on bolsters and blankets, and we'd be all cozied up. And she would just read Rumi for an hour and a half while we did all of these poses. But also other poets, because you read Rilke, and the Rilke poem, The Question, live the questions, love the questions. So it's, I beg you to be patient with everything that is unsettled in your heart, and to love the questions. And that was this exploration. That it was a question. It was like, how can I take this truth and this truth and hold them both. But Rilke says, don't seek the answers because you wouldn't be able to live them. So love the questions, live the questions, and maybe someday, without even noticing it, you'll live into the answer.
It's
And
not very comfortable, is it? And this is supposed to settle us somehow. Are we like can we be in on this joke? Right.
well, and it was kind of like that. Hearing that, it was like, oh, okay. So I don't have to have the answer and I can live. And that's the beauty of yoga. And what I was finding is that's also the beauty of Christianity. You know, it's an incarnated spirituality. Jesus comes into human form to show us how to self-realize. So he's the ultimate yogi, right? And it's through his human experience that he's teaching us how to find the way. Just as in yoga, it's through our experience. We don't spiritualize out of it in either tradition, though of course people do. In both yoga and Catholicism, people will spiritualize out and, you know, I'm above it all, you know, I'm not part of this heathen, you know, human existence. But the teachings in both traditions are, no, it's through our human experience. It's through the world that through our experience that we find liberation, that we find self-realization. So that was also really powerful in terms of a connection between the traditions that could then allow me to sort of hold the tension while I was still, you know, struggling to find, yeah, at least some comfort in putting things together. But the deeper the questions went, the more the connections came. You know, it was just so yeah, committing to do the work, trusting the teachings of both traditions, that in that process will kind of come the wisdom by letting go of mental constructs. And the other thing that's so interesting, I think, is Sanskrit and language, because, you know, as a Catholic, God meant a certain thing, brought up certain images, sin brought up certain images, even, you know, spirituality or religion or prayer or you name it, brought up these old images. And part of what I was actively trying to do was to reset that. So then you come in with Sanskrit and just tada, tada drashtahu, or Ishvara, Om, and then exploring new words with more expansive meanings kind of broke up the fixed ideas that were attached to language. You know, so sort of through another language, being able to come to a new understanding that then also incorporates the other tradition, but with a fresh perspective. So I think there's really something about studying in Sanskrit also, which of course Bhavani is always teaching us and telling us, but I think that was a critical piece of just being able to shift perspective.
You know, may I interject something? And I don't consider myself a historian. I can barely read a clock, as many of you know, or tell time. But you know, within the lore of yoga and spirituality, you know, there are documentations that the Christ actually during those missing years went east. I mean, it was really part of the whole trail. And even there was a large interface between the ancient Greek philosophers and the yogic mystics that was occurring. And so, you know, I've heard tell that, you know, there's footprints in Tibet of the Christ, and he was described as having quickly taken, it's like he had access to the Akashic field where he had these kind of you know, unrevealed gifts that just came online through yogic practices and was revered as being a Mahatma, like a realized being. And can you imagine like the tensions that he was facing? Because he didn't even have Christianity to lean into. So perhaps that was a response to the old time religion. And that old time religion, which was maybe more animist, and there was a fusion that came out of that confusion, which, and then going into the desert, right? Like, and sitting with this stuff. It's just interesting to really feel into his path as a human, birthing a new perspective that actually synergized. And I know from my father, who the way that he would learn languages is he would read the Old Testament in that language. And being, a Greek, you grow up learning ancient Greek, which is old, like Sanskrita. And a lot of terminology was changed. There was a neuter form for God. Things were slightly, and whether they were intentionally misconstrued or there just wasn't, verbiage within that particular lexicon, then it became interpreted in such a way.
Right. No, that's, I think, absolutely true. So a couple things. One is there's a reading that we hear constantly in the Catholic tradition of be perfect like your Father in heaven is perfect. And it's like, well, wow, that's a tall order.
First of all, I'm
That's not going to happen anytime soon. But in the translation, another translation of that word is whole. So it's not about perfection necessarily, but wholeness. So yes, some of those nuances, and I think that part of what Sanskrit opened up for me was the possibility of different understandings of the same word, because of course in Sanskrit each word has so many different ways of thinking about it. But I think I read that book, The Lost Years, during that year, and we talked about it then. But there is a scholar who had written about those years and this idea that from age 12, when we see Jesus in the temple, and we don't see him again until age 30 at the wedding at Cana, that during those years he went to Tibet, he went to India, he went to the East, and he was a practitioner. One of the teachings from Jesus is he says, "Take my yoke upon you." My yoke is light, the burden is light. And then of course yoga comes from the root yuj, which means yoke. So it's like there's those connections of, did he really mean take my yoga upon you? And throughout the Gospels, in almost every gospel reading, we see Jesus went off by himself to pray, or he had been on the mountain to pray, and then he came back and had this teaching with his disciples or whatever. But oftentimes that is either left out or just de-emphasized. But he was constantly in prayer and meditation, doing his own inward journey, as he was then encouraging others to follow that path.
And hearing take my yoke upon you, the burden is light. Doesn't that just smack of abhyasa vairagya? The burden of lightening up. The effort to let go, right? I mean, whew.
Yeah.
In.
Yeah. So those connections kept happening. For people who are listening and struggling with this as well, I would say that one of my godsons, the student was ready, the teacher appeared, was Bede Griffiths. And Bede Griffiths was a Benedictine monk for 25 years, and then in England, and then he left and went to India to find the other half of his soul. And he knew that he needed to integrate the East and West, and he did that by opening a Benedictine monastery, a small ashram in India, and he integrated, mostly using the Eastern rite of Catholicism, with the yogic teachings, which he talked about as yogic teachings, not Hindu teachings, but the yogic teachings. And he wrote prolifically. So he's a great resource for this interface. And then he established there was a lineage of monks that followed him who ended up with a monastery in Big Sur, California. And one of those monks, Father Cyprian, formed a Sangha in Santa Cruz. So I meet with this group of Catholics, a community founded by a Catholic monk, and we chant the Gayatri and other mantras. We read from Universal Wisdom as well as the Gospel. We talk about this interface. So it's a lovely, confluence of things that is available. It's accessible.
It's reminding me of when I used to kind of live in Mysore. I used to go there every year for about 3 months, and there was a Catholic church, with a cloister and a school. And I was always just like really touched by the seamless interface. I was like, wow, Hindus make great Catholics, And it didn't even seem like there was any kind of a division, and perhaps because they come from this tradition in which God has so many forms and expressions, and as I'm feeling into it, it's like the nuns who were wearing their habits was very kind of a reminiscent of the women with their saris and the way they would, cover their heads. And I was just actually, and even when I would like travel to Central America, like in Guatemala and, in Lake Atitlan and the Tutujil people, it was like, there wasn't really a conflict in the way that they wove in their indigenous tradition. And so it's quite interesting, because like clearly to me anyway, Christianity, something doesn't come out of nothing. So it does have indigenous roots. So it's easy for me to sit here and say that because I wasn't baptized in a particular church. So I kind of like have free creative license in that way. So it feels very seamless to me.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions that Ariana, who offered these wonderful queries was speaking about was, she was like, one of my greatest spiritual teachers is my grandmother, and how her grandmother felt this kind of like discomfort around the yoga, and where, and maybe that was from the doctrine that she had been taught, and where Ariana could sit and have like this fluid experience and not feel a schism within herself. She wasn't really sure how to have these conversations with somebody who is really like an Orthodox Catholic. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does go back to language. So I think that so I teach the sutras on Monday mornings with the satsang, and I just finished on this Friday morning with my gospel reflection that we do every Friday morning and post online. And it's been a lovely experience in that often I'm saying the same thing. The themes tend to run synchronistically together, and it's just talking about it in different ways and maybe leaning into different sources, but not to homogenize it, not to say that they're the same, but that there's a deep vein of truth that I think runs through both traditions, and the expression is then different. The yogic expression can also be very externalized, and certainly we've seen that in the West, that it becomes almost commercialized and very much about the body more than embodied wisdom. And in the Catholic tradition, it can also be externalized in terms of treating Jesus as a historical figure. He's someone who lived 2,000 years ago, so we repeat the rituals around his life, but maybe don't take it in as the living Christ light within us. And how would that teaching that he gave 2,000 years ago apply to us today? And knowing that that wisdom is still alive in us today. So for me, the beauty of both of these traditions is their ancient roots. So in Christianity and Judaism before it, with the thousands of years of yogis who then eventually Patanjali systematizes into the Yoga Sutra teachings. So I love that they're both these deep ancient traditions. And I'm also skeptical about some of the new new age or modern, if it's ungrounded somehow in an authoritative text or teacher, right? And I think that sometimes yoga is treated that way, and maybe not unfairly, by other spiritual traditions as being faddish or ungrounded. But when you drop into the deep teachings of Patanjali and the ancient tradition, then you uncover the gems. So I think that's part of it, is tapping into the deep roots and bringing it into modern experience, embodied experience in both traditions, because now we have some common language, especially as we unpack some of the terminology around sin, or even soul and spirit and consciousness and mind. What are those words and what do they mean? So what are we talking about? And certainly the word God is loaded across traditions. But it's interesting reading reading the sutra about Ishvara in the first book of the sutras, right? So we first get all of the practices that we can engage in, and abhyasa vairagya, that it's about practice and dispassion, and the calibers of students. And then we get, or you can surrender to the divine, or Ishvara pranidhanadva, just so it's given to us as an option, as another way of another path to self-realization. And then we get the sutras describing, well, what is Ishvara? The ancient of ancients, the teacher of teachers, the seed of all wisdom, all knowing. It's like the Baltimore Catechism. Who is God? God made me. God is all powerful, all knowing, all loving. It's so similar, but the language, of course, is really different. And then, so I think loosening up our understanding of the word God and actually looking at some of the deep mystic tradition within the Catholic Church about how the mystics understood and talked about God. The idea of a pervading consciousness or truth or energy of love is really much more what kind of comes through when we unpack the language.
It makes me reflect that, like, we've all come in with this teleological instinct to try to make sense of our existence. And across the board, there are certain a priori concepts, such as all powerful, all knowing, etc. And that we've been given different answers, right? In different languages, in different concepts. And, I'd like to also add that I love that some of the translators actually use va instead of being or, as being definitely. Did Sherry freeze on us? Oh no.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. We'll bring her back in. Yeah. Yeah.
Come
back to us, Sherry.
This is great because I have more questions for her.
I know. And how interesting that you were like raised in this spiritual community. Like in your community, how is the Christ consciousness addressed or revered or even discussed?
Yeah, I want to say like um so much in the collective was not, because so many people in my spiritual community did come from a Catholic background and sort of were recovering Catholics. But I love that how Sherry's talking about like imploring us to go deeper, like just go deeper. And at that time, everybody I think was still so young. I mean, they were like in their 20s. And there just wasn't, they didn't go deeper. But later on, I mean, Lee had people reading all of the Christian mystics, and there was like a whole series of books. I have to find the name of it. And I remember when I was little, like we had this class. I don't know if it was called like Religions Around the World, but we learned about all of these like world traditions. And I remember in my sketchbook, I drew a picture of a black Jesus. And I was probably like, I don't know, 5 or 6 at the time, but that's how my image of him was. And I remember looking back at that, and I had like written a little bit, a story about him, and he looked very, in my drawing, looked very African, like very like broad features, and like that was my interpretation of this Jesus character. And for myself, I always am so interested, because I don't know a whole lot, but I'm so interested in the story of his life, but then also everything that was written about him in the Gospels and other people's stories about him is just so interesting to me.
It's interesting too. I mean, you've probably read some of Yogananda's teachings. And he really, I love the way that he even like, and maybe it was through Yogananda, but like Christ, kind of like Krishna, as they believe that Christ was, I hope I don't like freak anybody out, I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't, but that Christ was one of the manifestations of Krishna, who was a manifestation of Lord Vishnu, who is like the sustainer, right? And oh gosh, I know Sherry's struggling to get back into our meeting here, but I wonder what kind of biblical references there are to that sense of the sustainer. Yeah.
My teacher's teacher, Yogi Ramsarat Kumar, loved Jesus. He always wanted people to read to him the stories from the Bible, and just be able to be steeped in that. I didn't ask why or how come, but I can only imagine that he was a great being, and his teachings were so much in alignment, like those heart teachings with yoga. I loved that Sherry brought that in, was, the yoke, the burden of lightening up, as you said. It's really beautiful.
Oh, here she is. Welcome back, Sherry. I think you're muted. So we were just kind of like weaving some threads there, and I was sharing about how Yogananda so beautifully would interweave, Christ consciousness, and even I believe it was Yogananda who spoke about how maybe there was an interface between Christ and Krishna, like maybe it's the American way of saying, Krishna as a form of Vishnu, and if there were any biblical references about being the sustainer.
Well, I think for me the connection is that there's the creator God. So in Christianity we have the Trinity, the creator, the Christ, and the Holy Spirit. So the creator being sort of the transcendent God, or God out there, and the Christ being the embodied human incarnation of the divine. So the living presence among us. And then the Holy Spirit being the, really immanent, kind of the pure divine, almost the Vishokavajyotismati, but that light that is within each of us, that connects us with each other, that connects us with the divine, sort of that complete, pranic energy throughout the universe, right? So Jesus then as the embodiment, really. So whether that's sustaining, I don't know, but it's the second person of the Trinity, the second representation, and the immanent, the really present to us in our human experience.
And
I
just
love that.
got my notes here because I have a friend, Jakob, who I met in structural integration training, who's a deep Christian mystic. And he actually has worked, I know you did Richard Rohr's program, and he's worked with Richard Rohr, and he refers to Jakob. Let's see, maybe oh my goodness. I can't find it, but it's a mystic monk who speaks about how, prayer happens when we enter into the interior of the heart. And this is where we no longer even take these former kind of like titles like father, but it becomes like the friend or this very, very intimate connection. And that really, to me, brings to heart that sensation of Vishokajyotishmati, which is that, like, I know in my father was born Greek Orthodox, but he didn't really subscribe to it. And that sense of the eternal flame.
Yes.
There.
Yes. And Vishokavajyotismati, so the Sutra 136, that we can meditate on the lotus of our own heart, or that sorrowless, luminous place within. So many of the monks and Catholic contemplatives throughout history have talked about it the way that you just did, in terms of the interiority of the heart. But Thomas Merton talks about the virgin point. The virgin point being the point within the heart that is sorrowless and luminous. And it's just, chicken skin, in the sense of these connections are absolutely there. And from the mystical side, meaning the experience of God or the divine or Ishvara, the actual experience, the language is very similar.
Wow. Isn't it wonderful? Do you get that sense when they say for something to be true, it has to be true for all things. And it's almost like the veils become thinner and there's like this incandescence that begins to fill the space that you're inhabiting. And, Rama would almost describe it like this sense of cellular lightness. And that, we're being invited to hold space for this great mystery.
Exactly.
And that is the tradition, right?
Right. And that holding the mystery is that loving the questions. That's the loving the questions and living the questions, and not reaching for quick or easy answers. But then as we do that, what illuminates is that rather than these things being contradictory or in tension with one another, they're really supporting each other and illuminating different aspects of each tradition that we otherwise might not see if we weren't kind of holding them, together.
Having just passed the threshold, I'm sorry, Shinay, I'll let you in, but having just passed the threshold yesterday, which we forgot was our 31st anniversary, and I know you and Matt just celebrated 44 years. It's giving me a wonderful insight that I wish I had known at the altar of loving as being a question. being in that space of question instead of, let me tell you how it is and how I need you to show up, right?
Exactly.
Right.
So I after 30 years, 35 years of being a divorce lawyer and mediator, wrote a book about marriage and opened it with the quote from Wendell Berry that in marrying one another, we marry the unknown.
Oh, ain't that the truth, sister?
And marry another is to marry the unknown. Because,
Wow.
and that's totally true. We don't know. We don't know what's happening tomorrow, you know?
We don't have a clue what we're getting into or what we're signing up for, but the answer is in the love, right? Like, oh my God, I didn't know that I didn't know that I had that impatience or patience, right?
Right. And similarly, I think when we hold ourselves with another person, right, we hold the commitment that we're going to grow and be with this person over the course of a lifetime. We also open up understandings of ourselves that we otherwise wouldn't see. And what is tension eventually becomes kind of illuminating aspects of ourselves to ourselves. So yeah, it's another beautiful journey.
So I'm just going to put in a plug for your book, Marriage Unveiled. Isn't that the fantastic title? And we'll put the notes in the we'll put a link to it in the notes. Even if you're not married to somebody else, there's so much soul stirring nectar in that. Sherry, you just are such a beautiful writer. Yeah.
Yeah, it's another whole journey.
Maybe we'll have to have Sherry on for the next part, for part 2.
I know. I'm like, Sherry, you've just been ingratiated in.
This is great. I just want to go back, Sherry, to something you said in the beginning about being in the classroom with Bhavani and her stating the sutra Tara Drashtuhu Svarupe Vashtanam. And then you mentioned this thing about really working with the messaging of guilt and sin and shame. And I just wanted to return to that and ask you, what did you do in working with those? Because the messaging you said you had received, in the Catholic tradition was like, I'm unworthy. And then how did you work with that what did you do?
That's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I just had this always unworthy, not good enough impression of myself. But I think my experience was that hearing that sutra that day in whatever pose I happened to be in, for some reason, I think it was down dog, but I don't know. It kind of pierced through and it just, it pierced through, as Bhavani would say, this Shastra just hit me as absolute truth. And it kind of dissolved that false notion of myself. And then the deeper study of Catholic teachings, and especially working with Richard Rohr and Jim Finley, Jim Finley would say, you don't have to be good. Mary Oliver also says that. You don't have to be good. In fact, you can't earn this love. Not only do you not need to earn this love, you couldn't earn it. You don't need to deserve it. In fact, you couldn't deserve it. It's like more, beneficent, whatever the word is, it's more beautiful and more forthcoming than we could ever deserve. So I think that it kind of blew that sense away. And then I was, kind of intellectually again trying to continue to remind myself of that and starting to notice the patterns of shame and self-defeating, that came out of a sense of being not enough. So it was the beginning of a lot of healing journey around that. And then when I do my gospel reflections on Friday mornings, I always try to reinforce those messages. So it's wonderful to have the richness of deeper understanding of the Catholic tradition to be able to bring those messages through in the voice of a Richard Rohr or a Jim Finley or a Thomas Merton, voices that Catholic, longtime Catholics can hear. I can't say, Patanjali says, I can't chant it in Sanskrit for them, but the same message is there from another teacher, and trying to bring that forward. And I'm still not there. I think it's part of our human condition and part of our mental, conditioning, to have those self-defeating misunderstandings. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
And isn't that, it's like the teacher's job, whether the teacher is embodied or we're, as it says in the sutras, it's like the original teachers of teachers is this divine force, the original seed, is to like nourish us with teachings. And also it's actually a natural response to be humbled by them, to be in a state of awe, right?
Right. And humility being groundedness and that closeness to the earth, humility, the hummus, the earth sense, not a shamed sense. That humility doesn't mean shame or lack of worthiness. It just means, being in the mystery, being in awe, being willing to be overcome, being willing to be pierced through.
That devotion to devotion, right? It's that sense of loving the question again.
Yeah, being brought to our knees. I want to share one story before we finish, which kind of blew my mind. And it always just confirms this interface for me. So I worked with a teacher here on Kauai, Anandra, who is teaching chanting and teaching some Sanskrit. So we had a session many, many years ago. And we chanted the Gayatri mantra, and she helped me with some Sanskrit pronunciation. And then she asked me if I was chanting the Gayatri regularly. And I said, yeah, I chant it often in the mornings. And she said, oh, well, how many times do you chant it? I said, oh, like 3 or 4 times. Like, she says, well, okay, so for the next 30 days, I want you to chant the Gayatri every morning, a half a mala. And I'm like, I don't even have a mala. Like, how many is a half a mala? She said, half a mala is 50, mala is 108, half a mala is 54. Like, okay, so I'll go find a mala and I'll figure this out. So I pull out my rosary beads. And how many beads are in the circle of beads? 54. So for the next 30 days, I took out my rosary each morning and chanted my 54 Gayatri mantras on my rosary. And it was just so beautiful. Just, yeah. So the connections just always continue.
That's so beautiful, because I was going to ask you for a story, but then also an embodiment practice. And if anybody needs an embodiment practice, you can just take out your rosary beads or your mala or whatever, and employ your body and your voice and your hands, or your, whatever it is. That's brilliant.
I think chanting is definitely a common practice between Catholicism and yoga, and the breath and the language. So I used to, when I was 7 years old, we had the mass in Latin and chanting through the Gregorian rite, which I resisted tremendously. And then I find myself chanting in Sanskrit. So yeah, I think the breath and the chanting, the meditation, teaching all comes together there.
Stephen Porges, who has really been the pioneer in the whole polyvagal theory. I remember hearing a podcast in which he speaks about how all of these rituals, and he cites the Catholic rituals in which everybody rise, everybody sit down. And then I think it was even the Hail Mary incantation, and how it synchronizes with our heart and these movements to actually tap us into this polyvagal resilience. So it's, gosh, it's just so layered and so life affirming, right? That even when we don't know what we're doing, there's so much good behind it. And for me, that has been like the joy of fruition of this whole experience, where I too was just trying to be such a good yogi, trying so hard to be good. And Ray speaks about this constantly with his teacher Emmaneulle Martin, who would say it's like, God is watching us at all times. And even the image of Saraswati, where she's sitting by the river, and that she is not sitting there with her monkey mind running rampant. She is in constant communion and in conversation and receiving these missives all the time. And Ray put it so beautifully. It's going in my book. He's like, one of the ghost writers. And that like the devotee knows that the answer to every question has to be the most holistic and the most integrated. And that's what Dharma is.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that communion, even when we think we're not in it, right? That's just a thought wave itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're always in it. Always in it.
And we're always being guided, right? It's like you can't make a wrong choice in some ways, because our story has yet to be told, right?
Right.
It's really comforting right now in our current, country's climate. This is where I've got to just lean into that.
Right. And knowing that Christ, the divine, the however we want to think of this power of love and consciousness, is present with us in the darkness. Not necessarily going to manipulate things to save us in some way, but is absolutely present with us.
And isn't saving coming from like salva, which means healing, which
Yeah.
means wholeness and greater integrity? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. Sherry, is there anything else you want to share in closing? I'm sure you'll be back, but for today.
Well, the other thing that I was wanting to just add, we talked about the surrender to the divine being optional in the first book. In the second book, it's not optional. It's absolute part of Kriya Yoga. It's an absolute part of the niyamas and the Ashtanga system. So it's no longer optional, it's essential. And again, it's not that we take that on faith. That's a practice. That's what the ancient yogis have found to be effective in reaching self-realization. So it's a necessary part of the whole. So yes, I would say it's spiritual, but it kind of it finds its way into each of our consciousness in its own time.
Oh my gosh, you just opened up a whole new portal, and I'll just see this for our next conversation. We three being like deep lovers of the Yoga Sutra know that that first chapter is written for a very unique kind of an individual who's already a Vairagi, who's really not interested in the world. But perhaps, and the second chapter is for somebody who's like a householder and dealing with the world. Okay, how do you find the sacred, and offering you ritual practices and whatnot? And perhaps that first chapter is how to not how, when you're already not in the world, how to be in the world. I don't know. There's a little seed. We'll just drop it there and see what happens.
Well, how to be in the world would be an amazing topic to explore these days.
I love it.
Stay tuned, everyone.
This has been so fun. Thank you so much, Sherry and Bhavani. It's just wonderful to be with both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So much love.